Again, just like our other statements that we've completed so far, there's kind of different sections to this enterprise budget. It's going to be very similar to your income statement. It's just, again, on that one enterprise. So it's going to contain three primary sections. We're going to have our revenue section, and we're going to look at a variety of different enterprise budgets. So that enterprise budget might be called revenue. It also may be called income. It also may be called receipts. So when you see those different terminology in different types of budgets from different locations, which is something we will do, we'll look and evaluate at different places. What's enterprise budgets look like in Kansas? What do they look like in Colorado? What do they look like in Nebraska or Wyoming? So as we think about those, they might be labeled differently. Keep in mind what those terms are. Variable costs, we're going to take all of our expenses and split them into two categories. We want to know whether or not we can cover just our variable costs, because that's kind of how we decided to make production decisions. If you remember from our economic principles that we just learned, we only produce and continue producing if we can cover the variable costs. Sometimes we're not making profit and we produce to minimize losses, but we still keep producing. If we can't cover the variable costs, that's when it's time not to produce that product. That's why in our expense section, we want to make sure that we have variable and fixed costs separated out. Variable costs may also be called operating costs. And then our fixed costs, again, those costs that are pretty constant, don't necessarily change with how much output we produce. We're also going to call those ownership costs. So when you think about your fixed cost section, go back to those dirty five that I gave you earlier in your economic principles we were learning. And those key dirty five are depreciation, interest, rent, taxes, and insurance. Sometimes rent, we won't call it rent, we'll call it land cost, land value. It'll be some way to value our land. And then we might have depreciation and interest on our machinery. And then we might have interest on land. So we might have different components of those major categories. The other one that sometimes we'll also include is something that we just call general maintenance. And that gives us a little miscellaneous ability to give some value to the things we know we're going to have to upkeep on different enterprises on a yearly basis that we probably are going to pay no matter how much we produce or not. So fixed costs will be those primary depreciation, interest, rent, land value, taxes, and insurance types of costs. And then our variable costs are, of course, everything else it takes us to produce things. So when we're talking about crop enterprises, it's things like our seed and our chemicals and our fuel and our fertilizers and all of those different things that it takes us for inputs to produce the products. So as we do that, in terms of our setup, basically here's how our setup will line up. We'll start out at the very top and we'll list the enterprise we're going to budget, and then we're going to show the units. So we want to say that this is for 1 acre of watermelons, for example. That's going to be the one we're going to look at. And then we're going to have a revenue section, a variable cost section, a fixed cost section, and our bottom line is going to be our profit. So that setup looks something like this. This is an example of a watermelon function that we're going to start with for just your introduction to how the enterprise budget works. And basically we'll take, and here's our introduction. This is the setup at the beginning. We're going to go ahead and list what the enterprise is and then what the units are. So this is an enterprise budget for watermelon production for 1 acre. We're going to start with the revenue section, and in the revenue section, here's what we'll do. And every time for crops, it's going to be exactly the same. We're going to list out the yield that will occur on that 1 acre. So we've never dealt with watermelons yet, so this will be different for us. But watermelon is measured in hundredweights in terms of their production levels. So we're going to look at 400 hundredweights as the average yield. Now, keep in mind this is a budget. So this is a little different for us too. Budgeting means it hasn't happened yet. So when we are now working in what we call budgets, we're going to do enterprise budgets, partial budgets, and cash flow budgets. That means that those things haven't occurred. It's not after the fact and we already did it and we're trying to see what things were. We're trying to estimate how much it does cost us to grow this product, so we know what we're going to have for costs. We know what selling price we need to get and so on. So therefore, in our revenue section, what we have is we have an estimated average yield that we are expecting for this upcoming year. An enterprise budget is something that would be done on a yearly basis, and I'm going to do it for this year. So if I'm doing 2020, I'm estimating that I'm going to have 400 hundredweights of watermelon per acre as my average yield during this year. Now, if you start a year and you know what the last 5 years of yields have been, and you've kind of kept track of what your yields have been like, but you come into 2020 and you say, okay, wait a minute, I think this is going to be a drier year. Or this is going to be, we're expecting this year. If there are changes in that, then even whatever your average yield had been, you might adjust that. You might say, you know what, this is what I expect for this year. So here's our expected yield. Our price that we're going to use, the selling price we're going to use, is also expected. So this $16 per hundredweight is an expected selling price. And I would do that by looking at futures prices. In watermelon, there's no futures prices, of course, but I might be looking at what prices have been consistently available for me as a producer lately coming up through this past year. What have been the average prices? And then what is expected for this next year? So we've got expected yield and expected selling price. 400 hundredweights at $16 per hundredweight is a total revenue expected per acre of $6,400. So here's my total revenue that I'm expecting. I then